In the 1960s, a new generation of Mexican Americans created a militant social movement in response to the anger and frustration that had been building for so many years within their community. In California and Texas, they demanded humane treatment in the fields where they labored. In New Mexico, they fought to reclaim land once owned by their ancestors. It became clear that without political power, Mexican Americans would remain second-class citizens.
And we're poor, man. I mean, we're poor, and nobody wants to do nothing about it. You still kissing the Democratic Party, thinking they're gonna save you, and they ain't gonna do it.
In a small South Texas town, a new political party took shape that threatened to change the political landscape of America.
These are Chicano people here. You've never met us. We're not in the dictionary. It's a brand new ballgame. You're going to have to relearn all your stereotypes and all your myths because we are about to begin creating new ones, tough ones, and great ones. And I suggest you learn fast if you want to match us.
As the nation watched, Chicanos took on the most challenging quest of the Mexican-American civil rights movement.
Soy de Texas, es mi orgullo ser chicano. En los barrios me pueden encontrar.
In the 1960s, Mexican Americans made up the majority of the population of South Texas. Most were migrant farm workers, poor, with little education. After picking the winter crops, many of them travel across America in search of yet another harvest.
This part of the country has been built on the backs of the Mexican Americans. So you had every bit as much segregation, unequal education, and so forth as the African American did in the Deep South.
The few wealthy landowners were Anglo. The huge majority of the population was locked into a labor pool of just reserve labor. Owners of businesses were all Anglos. I don't recall in the downtown area a single Mexican-American business when I was growing up.
In Crystal City, where Jose Angel Gutierrez grew up in the 1940s and 50s, Mexican Americans accounted for 85% of the population, but they had no political representation. For years, Mexican Americans had been denied the right to vote by obstacles like poll taxes, literacy tests, and gerrymandered voting districts.
You take a county where we might be the majority of the population. Well, what the Anglo establishment had done was to divide the county in such a way that it was simply impossible for Mexican Americans to really gain political power.
We had the poll tax back then. Most people did not have the money, and if they did, they had the sense not to spend it on the privilege of voting, because it was always white candidates, and that was always the results.
the situation was people were, in many cases, denied the right to vote because they didn't speak English. In other cases, they were in sort of peonage to a boss or patron and were required to vote as he wanted them to. He would pay the poll taxes and they would vote for who he said to vote for. So it was really a, an archaic system.
We did work very hard. All 5 of us went house to house as
In 1963, for the first time in more than 100 years, Mexican Americans put up their own candidates for office and challenged Anglo politicians for control of city government.
We had to be ingenious and invented cakewalks and tamale sales and dances where you would pay supposedly for the cake or the tamales or the dance, but end up getting registered to vote.
Although only a student, Gutierrez was active in the campaign, making speeches, registering voters, organizing rallies. The 5 candidates known as Los Cinco surprised political observers by defeating the Anglo mayor and the All-Anglo City Council. The victors quickly learned that long-standing traditions do not change easily. First, Texas Ranger A.Y. Alley refused to turn over the keys to City Hall. A phone call from Texas Governor John Conley forced him to accept the new officials.
We decided we was going to try and put some...
The local business community was more effective in its strategy.
Didn't you lose your job just after the election results were announced?
Yes, sir, I sure did.
You cut your salary, yes.
In San Cine, I'm going on $35 a week. I don't know how long I could have stand it, but I'm doing it right now.
They began trying to indict one of the members of the council for a check that had bounced. They tried to remove 1 or 2 others for being late in payments of utilities. And they ran a slate against us the next time around and beat us.
The rise and fall of Los Cinco echoed a long history of conflict between Mexican Americans and the South Texas power structure.
In the history of oppression of Mexicanos or Chicanos in the United States, Texas was probably the worst. You have more of a history of conflict. You have more of a history of land grabbing, outright land grabbing. You have more of a history of just outright physical oppression of the Mexican population in Texas. In fact, in the 20s, the New York Times had an editorial that's saying that the indiscriminate killing of Mexicans in Texas had reached the proportions of being a scandal.
The Texas Rangers were created in 1823 to protect settlers from outlaws. They had a reputation for intimidation and violence toward Mexican Americans.
I was coming up Military Road with Colonel Hickok, and they came to some big mesquite trees, and there was 4 Mexicans hanging by the neck. The colonel says, "Peavy, I guess the Rangers have been through here."
In the face of this frontier justice, terrorized Mexican Americans were reluctant to fight for their civil rights.
Down there, law enforcement was used for private purposes. They were acting as a private police force for some of those farmers down there, employers down in the valley. This is back in what, 69, 70, somewhere in there. And certainly for the years and years before that, no action was brought against the Rangers. They were just a law unto themselves.
Ranger Alley and the Anglo Council were back in power. It was business as usual in Crystal City.
I never forgot those kinds of dynamics that go on, and from then on became vigilant that it's not just important to take power. You've got to be able to hold power and govern effectively. So I learned by watching.
Jose Angel Gutierrez went on to graduate school at St. Mary's University in San Antonio. There he met Willie Velasquez. Before long, they were working together to bring change to Mexican-American politics.
We had a regular study circle. We'd read about King and we'd go look for him. We traveled Atlanta several times. We'd read about Stokely Carmichael and the SNCC activists, and we'd track them down. We'd learn about Corky Gonzalez and Reyes Tijerina, and we'd go find them, or Chavez. I mean, we actually read and then went out and got informed firsthand.
Gutierrez wrote his thesis on the conditions for revolution in South Texas.
What he meant by revolution was fundamental change in electoral, economic, and social context. Remember, at this time in South Texas, Mexican Americans were legally barred in many ways from taking part in politics.
Early attempts to organize Mexican Americans began in the 19th century. Some successes came in 1929 with the formation of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens.
LULAC was very much aware of the oppression which Mexican Americans were experiencing in South Texas. They're very successful in breaking down some discriminatory barriers in the area of education, in the area of employment, in the area of health services.
By the mid-40s, Mexican-American servicemen and women returned from World War II, only to find that discrimination was still part of everyday life. These conditions led to the creation of the American GI Forum.
What galvanized the organization was an incident where a returning war hero was refused burial in his own hometown by the Anglo mortuary funeral home.
Felix Longoria from Three Rivers, Texas, died a hero during the liberation of the Philippines.
The idea that a hero could not be buried in his own hometown angered people so much that it really symbolized a lot of the concern, the grievances that these Latino servicemen had.
The GI Forum sent a telegram to then Senator Lyndon Johnson. He intervened, arranging for Longoria to be buried with honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Many Mexican Americans remembered Johnson's support at election time.
I ask your help in this campaign.
In 1960, John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign recognized the potential power of groups like LULAC and the GI Forum and solicited Mexican American voters.
John F. Kennedy, candidato demócrata a la presidencia, quiere combatir estos males. Es el único candidato que se preocupa.
Kennedy was an extremely popular political figure among Mexican Americans, primarily because he was Catholic, and primarily because he capitalized on that Catholicism by reaching out to the Mexican American population, which was something that prior presidential candidates did not do.
Political activists formed Viva Kennedy clubs throughout the Southwest. Kennedy won Texas by 20,000 votes.
I do not ask you to choose.
The state's Mexican Americans voted for him 10-1. Kennedy's election gave Mexican American political activists a newfound sense of power and raised their expectations. But they were soon disappointed.
Very small crumbs of the political pie were passed out to the Mexican-American communities. And so there was this disappointment, especially through the 60s, on the part of the Spanish-speaking youth with the democratic lack of fulfillment of promises and intentions.
Chicano activists, impatient for change, believed they had better strategies for getting political power than those of the previous generation.
There was a great dissatisfaction building within the community, especially among the youth, over the old line organizations like the GI Forum, like LULAC, who had by this point been reduced to social clubs that did a little. They would go out and they would never really protest anything because they didn't want to compromise their dignity.
By 1968, Gutierrez and other students from St. Mary's formed a more militant alternative.
If you can't be an activist, if you can't risk everything, don't bother join us. Join the GI Forum, join LULAC, because we were looking for people that would go out, take on tactics that were in every way confrontational.
We were convinced that we were the generation that was going to recover the land in the Southwest, not by taking the land, but by taking political control of the institutions in the land.
Jose Angel Gutierrez began organizing the Mexican Americans in Crystal City, determined to win back the government that had been denied Los Cinco.
He was at the right place at the right time. We all needed change, but we weren't quite sure how to go about it.
Gutierrez targeted the schools where young people were fed up with negative stereotypes.
Every time in our history books they talked about Mexicanos, it was about the Mexicano bandido, you know, all the bad things the Mexicanos did. And we were seen as lazy. I still remember seeing in the history books the Mexicano with his sombrero over the top and being asleep. And that's what we had to deal with, the image that they had of us there. And that was projected onto us, and it was hard to overcome that image that they had.
And then, on the sidelines of high school football, this anger found a common cause.
In these small towns, the whole civic life revolves around high school football. The cheerleaders were always the most popular, the most beautiful, the most whatever to succeed, and so forth.
At Crystal City High School, Mexican Americans outnumbered Anglos 8-1. But school officials would only allow one Mexican American on the cheerleading squad. When Diana Palacios tested that policy, she was rejected by the teachers' committee.
That's when we all really sort of opened our eyes and looked around and realized that all these things had been going on, and we had just kind of sat back and let it happen.
Students threatened to walk out unless given Mexican-American cheerleaders, teachers, and counselors. They also demanded courses in Mexican-American history and something that had long been a sore point, the right to speak Spanish in school.
Which we presented to the school board and would not listen to our demands.
I had been caught speaking Spanish, and one of the rules was you do not speak Spanish, not in the halls, not in the recreation or anywhere. And one of the teachers sent me to the principal's office, and I got paddled.
With a boycott imminent, organizers hoped to get parents involved.
We went and asked the men to support us. And of course said no, because if they came, they would kill all these principals and teachers and whatnot. And they said, well, go see the vieja, take the wife. They'll do it. So we took the wife. And the wife was thrown out summarily from the school board. So then we went back to them and said, they threw your wife out, guy. You know, and they're saying your daughter's ugly. She can't be a cheerleader. They only want the pretty ones with the white legs. Now, there's no father who thinks he's got an ugly daughter. The school board insulted them too. So they had no way out. They said, you know, you kids are right. Mama, you're right. I mean, they don't listen to anybody. They won't even listen to us. So you do what you got to do. So the kids started chanting and screaming, walk out, walk out, walk out.
On December 9th, 1969, 700 students walked out of Crystal City High School.
The fact that the Mexican-American students walked out over a cheerleading position was very, very significant and took an enormous amount of courage at that time. It went directly to the whole hierarchy down there to try to change that around.
Representatives of the United States Department of Justice intervened to mediate the crisis.
An agreement has been reached between the school board, the parents, and the students. Some of the students have returned to school this afternoon, and it's my understanding that the rest of them will return in the morning.
The school board agreed to all of the demands. 3 months later, Diana Palacios was voted head cheerleader of Crystal City's varsity squad. Building on this success, Mexican Americans in Crystal City created their own political party, La Raza Unida, the United People.
We no longer accept the fact that we are powerless and need to be complaining about our powerlessness. We know we're powerful. We know we can be organized. We know we can triumph. We know that our destiny is not tied to holes in the fields, but tied to much greater and loftier goals and levels, if we would only take the step in that direction. La Raza Unida is an example of this kind of step.
It was very clear in the minds of everybody there that a political party was important because, you know, we had come to the conclusion that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were one and the same. You know, it was the same animal with two heads.
For the first time since the defeat of Los Cinco, large numbers of Mexican Americans registered to vote in Crystal City. This time, they registered for the Raza Unida party. The party found its greatest support among women.
95% of the people that were registering voters and getting people out to the polls were women. And yet we didn't have a say-so in the decision-making process. We actually had a walk-in to one of their meetings and said, hey, we don't want to be the tamale makers and the workers, and we don't want to be the busy bees, you know, we really want to be part of the decision-making process. And at that time, half the men broke off of Raza Unida, and they said they didn't want to be part of it if the women were going to be involved. The group split because of that.
As the party launched its campaign, women proved to be strong organizers.
When women came into the party, they fell into this greater context of La Familia de la Raza. So when we organized or went out to recruit people, we went out to recruit wives, mothers, girlfriends, sisters, sisters-in-law. And because of the context of political familism, it was easy for us to recruit women.
By participating in the decision-making process, women of La Raza Unida set a precedent that changed the way men and women worked together in the movement. Raza Unida campaigned to take back control of the Crystal City government, working not only to win, but to win decisively.
The
Raza Unida platform was bilingual education, regulation of public utilities, farm subsidies, an equitable tax structure, all of the issues that appealed to a working class population was essentially the backbone of the Raza Unida platform.
So on election day, in April 1970, out of 16 possible races that we could win, in the school board and the city council, we won 15. It was a total wipeout, just about.
The business community denounced Raza Unida. The local newspaper led the charge.
Raza Unida has brought nothing but hate, distrust, turmoil, and complete financial irresponsibility to our community. The only way to stop this disruptive and destructive force that is attempting to gain complete control over people's lives and livelihoods is to refuse to vote for candidates who are supported by La Raza Unida.
The Anglo population reacted with horror and recoiled from this prospect. They, after all, had been at the top of the heap, and all of a sudden the levers of political power were removed, and other people had them. And not only did they have them, but they were almost turning the tables in terms of, as the Anglos perceived it, you know, they were now suffering discrimination.
There's about 30 or 35% of the Mexican American here in Zavala County that vote for the Raza, and the other 60 or 70% are not voting, or afraid to vote.
Why are they afraid to vote?
They are afraid of harassment and intimidation.
But in fact, Crystal City leaders couldn't stop the Raza Unida party, which was gaining support throughout Texas. In 1972, Ramsey Muñiz, a former football star at Baylor University and an attorney, announced that he would run for governor under the Raza Unida banner.
The key to the city, but we just don't want the key. We want the key to the whole state.
Ramsey Muñiz was a very attractive candidate. He was very able, he was tireless. I mean, he went out and campaigned day and night. He is what people wanted to be like. He made you proud of being a Mexican American.
And he'll tell you, I went to fight for my country. Hell, if we're good enough to die for the country, we're good enough to get an education in this country.
At first, the Democratic Party of Texas was unconcerned.
I don't think that we took the party that seriously. We didn't think in terms of impact, in terms of numbers, that they were making the strides that they hoped to make, and that it was still important that we address the broad Mexican-American community of Texas to win elections, and that's what we did.
The Ramsey Muñiz campaign brought widespread attention to the Raza Unida party.
We need to have 67,000 registered voters in the state so that we can get on the ballot.
Chapters appeared in Nebraska, New Mexico, Michigan, and Arizona. Before long, the Raza Unida party was registering voters and fielding Mexican-American candidates in 16 states.
The Raza Unida party crystallized the sense of nationalism, or a culmination of nationalism, I could put it that way. And a lot of my compañeras and compañeros consequently began to say, you know what, we need to manifest our movement's mission and goals in art form. Talking about politics and talking about struggle and power, but we were talking about art form and poetry and talking about writing, you know, and it was a very psychological, liberating force, what I call the decolonizing of our minds, to not only promote an identity of Chicanismo or you know, who we were as an indigenous people, but more importantly, as creators.
In Colorado, Corky Gonzalez saw his dream of a third political party for Chicanos envisioned at the Denver Youth Conference becoming a reality. He lost no time organizing a Denver chapter.
Would you like to register in La Raza Unida?
How do you spell that?
But in Los Angeles, Raza Unida produced division in the Mexican-American community.
So that we can get on the ballot. If you've been a Democrat for 50 years, and you've seen the conditions remaining the same for 50 years and nothing ever changes.
The idea of leaving the Democratic Party for this new organization was too radical for many Mexican-American voters. But Chicano activists saw it differently.
We can start working to elect our own things, elect our own candidates. It takes you about a minute to register.
The positives were that for the first time we had our own party. On the negative side, however, was what happened with Raul Ruiz and Richard Latorre electoral campaign in Los Angeles, which was pitting Mexican against Mexican.
We're tired of everybody saying it's not our jurisdiction.
Assemblyman Richard Alatorre was the incumbent.
And the reason that we ran in this race was primarily to challenge the Democratic Party.
Raul Ruiz, a young college professor, was the challenger.
All poor urban people are going to vote Democrat. And if
Raul Ruiz was a Raza Unida candidate. And the party, the Democratic Party, had not historically been responsive to our needs. So we knew the need. I mean, we saw the logic and the virtue in taking on another Chicano Democrat.
The idea of a third party was particularly offensive to those of us who had been working for change within the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Young people were much more open to the idea of a third party, of an ethnic party, than some of us who had been around, and sort of the GI Forum, LULAC folks.
Ruiz lost, but his Raza Unida campaign took a substantial number of votes from the Democratic Party. For the first time in decades, a Democrat had lost to a Republican in the 48th Assembly District of Los Angeles.
Do you feel that the Mexican American is going to desert the Democratic Party this time around?
Not at all. I don't think so. Why should they? Democratic Party is the only party that's ever done anything for the Mexican Americans. You might know that.
Vital government services controlled and provided by what is
Many Mexican Americans argued that the Democratic Party hadn't done enough.
On the City Council of Los Angeles, made up of 15 members, not a single Chicano. Of the 5 members of the County Board of Supervisors, there has never in its 100-year history been a member from a minority community. The state legislature numbers 120, yet you will find only 2 Mexican Americans, both in the lower house. We have no U.S. senator in Congress, and only a single congressman sits in the House of Representatives.
Established Mexican-American politicians were part of the problem in the eyes of young Chicanos.
So many of us who were just barely getting our feet wet in terms of our political baptism at this time were becoming very angry and disillusioned at everything that represented the institution, not to trust anybody who represented the system, and that we felt that they had not done enough and that they had, in fact, sold out.
Back in Texas, Jose Angel Gutierrez and the Raza Unida grew increasingly militant.
We recognize that the barriers to our integrating into the society and to uplifting ourselves is the gringo who's put the barriers, who makes us, drop out of school, who keeps us in bad health, who doesn't pay us good wages, who prohibits our unions, and so on and so on and so on. So until we get rid of those elements, we're not going to progress. We're not going to be free. So yes, the gringo must go.
An Anglo group called the Citizens Committee denounced Gutierrez.
He has advocated publicly the killing of gringos. Does this mean only a certain age group of gringos? Or does it extend to the children, too? At what age does one draw the line? Where does the insurrection begin?
Henry B. Gonzalez, the first Mexican-American from Texas elected to Congress, also had something to say.
As having a responsibility to smoke out and to expose these false and mistaken voices of hatred. I feel that I fought against those in the majority who were preaching the same hatred 12 years ago in a different context, that I have the same responsibility to expose it among the minority, even if it is the minority from which I emerge.
That became the central part of my life, to be a militant, to be an activist, to be radical in the design of solutions. Because if you're anything less than radical, if you're just simply moderate, you're part of the problem. And certainly if you're not engaged and involved, then you are the problem.
Gutierrez's friend Willie Velasquez from St. Mary's days left Raza Unida to pursue the more moderate strategy of voter registration within existing parties.
We as people trying to get people elected.
He was opposed to the notion of the creation of a third political party that was specifically set up for Mexican Americans. So for him it was a very tactical kind of choice of saying that's not going to work, and that's why we can't go towards a third political party.
It wasn't that he was trying to be apart from the Raza Unida. He just didn't believe in an ethnic party, so it violated our sense of integration, a sense of trying to build a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multiracial society that to try to set up barriers was not what we're about. What we're trying to do is to knock these barriers down.
The very existence of the Raza Unida party raised a fundamental question. Is it better to work within the existing political system or to be totally independent of it.
The very people that are in those buildings, they're all on welfare.
Corky Gonzalez believed that to have a real voice in politics, Mexican Americans needed their own party.
My feelings were of having a party that would serve its people, not a party that is serving a governor or serving some senator or serving the president of the United States, to serve their people.
We've had civil rights legislation for many years now, but we have also had so many amendments to it that they're not worth the paper written on.
Corky Gonzalez was adamant that there was nothing to be gained from supporting Democrats or Republicans. Despite his past rhetoric, José Ángel Gutiérrez saw value in the possibility of forcing concessions from the Democrats and Republicans. He believed Raza Unida votes could be used to gain leverage within the two major parties.
People who run for office need to be asked, what you going to do for me and what have you done lately, as a prerequisite before giving my vote. Richard Nixon and George McGovern were no different. We asked them those questions then.
It isn't going to be a good country for any of us to live in.
We didn't want to be attached to Republicans or Democrats. They were both wrong. They had both created damage against us. La Raza Unida stood for our independence, not for some phony politician to make deals. We could have made our own deals.
A dramatic confrontation between Gutierrez and Gonzalez was fast approaching. (1972), a presidential election year. Members of Raza Unida met in El Paso, Texas, to hold their party's first national convention.
For me, the eye-opening experience was that there were Chicanos all over the country. I mean, places that we typically didn't think in those days you would find Chicanos. And I think for the most part, we were just excited about the fact that we actually had a convention that we were going to. This was a real political party. And for a lot of us, it was educational in the sense that most of us had no clue about how, a political convention works. We knew the word delegates, but we didn't necessarily know what that meant in terms of a convention.
It was a wonderful experience. I mean, here we are with our movement, with our own party, and we're making history. Unfortunately, we had not reached all of our people. I mean, even our own families, we had a lot of confusion about why Chicano, for example? Why call yourself Chicano, We were Mexicano, right? And we had to explain to our own families why we were Chicano. And we were Chicano because we were proud to be Mexicans, We were proud of our cultural heritage. We were proud of our indigenous roots. That's what Chicano meant to us. It was a very exciting moment in my life, and it was a very scary moment too in many ways, because by that time we knew that there were dangers out there. We knew that the party was a definite threat as perceived by those in power.
A brief announcement: there is a press conference going on, I understand.
We know that the party was under surveillance by the CIA and the FBI. They feared a separatist movement. Analogies were drawn between the Raza Unida party and the separatist movement that was going on in Canada at the time. People feared that we would somehow form an alliance with Mexico, and that Mexico would somehow then come and claim its land back from the United States, and the Raza Unida would be the instrument by which that claim would be made. People simply feared the rise of radicals to power.
We'd been called everything communist, and people believed it. Even your own families in some cases thought that you were some kind of lunatic, some kind of radical. And then there was the personal things like people who threatened both in the mail and in the phone at all hours of the day and night, who'd call and, you know, basically say they were going to get rid of you somehow.
Issues that the Chicano community is willing to mobilize around, you know, the kind of issues that we can...
On the convention floor, delegates debated the age-old dilemma of the Mexican-American community: to work within the traditional two-party system or to go its separate way.
To me, La Raza Unida was a dream of an independent party, of people that believed alike, who were not represented by either Republicans or Democrats, and that we would make our own decisions about our own needs.
All in favor, raise your hand.
Even as Raza Unida activists were debating the two-party system, a group of Chicano legal activists won a landmark court case that would have a profound impact in the years to come. MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, was formed to address, through the legal system, civil rights issues affecting Mexican Americans. In 1972, they challenged the at-large voting policy in Bexar County, Texas, that had traditionally prevented Mexican Americans from becoming elected to state office. White versus Register set a legal precedent. In subsequent years, many city, county, and state governments opted to change voluntarily rather than risk losing a court battle with MALDEF. At the Raza Unida convention, delegates debated issues that would make up the national party platform.
Do you want to take a vote against the NRA and for gun control?
We say that we want gun control. That means que estamos controlando.
The Texas delegation goes on record as supporting immediate withdrawal, total involvement in Vietnam.
Okay, land. Honor original Mexican and Spanish land grants. Cease taxation of the land.
I'm against that because all you're doing is giving it to a rich few, you know, Spaniards.
We could go out and tell the truth. We could go out and campaign with real issues and take real positions that the other two parties would never dare take. We had no special interest supporting us. We had no self-interest that we had to guard, you know. So we wound up taking some very, very incredibly progressive positions.
The objective here is to remove the Anglo police departments out of places where, like Los Angeles and East LA, where the sheriff and the LAPD are strictly Anglo-oriented, which makes no sense at all. You have, you know, 500,000 people with the Anglos running them.
Delegates voted on whether Raza Unida should back one of the presidential candidates.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
The national position of the Partido de la Raza Unida on the first national convention: support none of the two major candidates for president of the United States.
The vote emphatically demonstrated the delegates' preference for their own political party and endorsed Corky Gonzalez's separatist position. The convention now faced the job of electing a party leader.
I don't think we should limit ourselves to anything. And certainly we should not, you know, immediately pull back our heads under the shell like turtles when there's a little bit of reaction from whites or concern about whites or even some, you know, rock throwing within our own people, you know. Maybe our own people are kind of...
It was clear that Corky was making a big move to be the only person elected at the convention. And I decided then to run against him. So then I turned to a fellow from California, Raul Ruiz, to take charge of the convention so that I could have time to organize against Corky.
Missouri.
You have two men, both who are very capable, both who are good organizers, both men who are very proud, and both of whom were completely confident in their positions, that they were right.
And we cannot afford the luxury of petty bickering and fights on minute rhetorical points in this convention. We must display
the fact that he had opposition and that Corky also wanted to be the chair is good.
I mean, it's just like any other political party. It's better to have more than one person interested because you mobilize more people.
We were assuming that we're fighting against a stacked deck. So whether we won or not, we were going to give it as good a fight as we could.
Earlier, when we had made this decision that the method of voting of the individual states, and we had made this decision earlier, would be left up to the states. We did not say at this time that we would now go counter to that decision.
The debate centered around whether to vote by delegation or to vote individually.
Okay, here I go. Listen carefully.
Gonzales supporters were convinced that he could win if states voted in blocks. Gutierrez would have the advantage if votes were cast individually.
How could we in our conference not count everybody's vote, regardless of whether it was against your interest or support somebody else? So basically, as chair, I allowed the motion to go through that would give the vote to everybody to cast their votes.
You are influencing the rest of the states. That's right. And you are out of order.
I would like to ask that both of these nominees come to the platform.
The California vote was split, and as I recall, there was even a half a vote someplace, and God knows how we got to half a vote. But anyway, we did.
California cast 17.5 votes for Jose Angel Gutierrez, 48.5 votes for Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez.
Votando 64 votos a favor de José Ángel Gutiérrez con un abstention.
256 and 1/6 vote for José Ángel Gutiérrez. José Ángel Gutiérrez is the new chairman.
We changed the nature of politics, certainly from the perspective of Mexican Americans. It's never going to be the same again. The fact that we said it was okay to take power and to control your own destiny were pretty radical thoughts then. Now it's pretty much accepted, which means we won on that one.
Our people are awakening and their eyes are opening.
2 months later, Ramsey Muñiz lost the governor's race in Texas to Democrat Dolph Briscoe. But by receiving more than 200,000 votes, Muñiz denied the Democratic Party a majority for the first time in the 20th century.
When the Mason, do you think you're going to win? Les digo, I've already won. Look at this right here.
He got about 250,000 votes in 1972 against Briscoe and almost caused Briscoe's defeat. They counted that race till very late at night. By golly, that was close that night, and he almost pulled off what I think was the plan, and that is, if we can't win, we're not going to let the conservative Democrat win.
6 months after the convention in El Paso, an FBI memo called for tighter surveillance of Corky Gonzalez's crusade for justice. Denver authorities believed that crusade members were armed and dangerous. On March 17, 1973, over 230 Denver police officers surrounded the Crusade for Justice headquarters. Within minutes, a confrontation erupted, lasting for over an hour and a half. Police killed a 20-year-old Crusade member.
My best friend was killed. Over 60-some people were arrested. I was shot in the back. 4 police officers were shot. Numerous people were hurt.
Later that evening, a Crusade for Justice building was bombed. Fearing for their safety, Crusade members began leaving the organization. The Crusade for Justice would never fully recover. In Texas, Raza Unida continued to field candidates with little success. By 1974, the South Texas town of Crystal City was the last stronghold of the Raza Unida party. Despite its short life, the Raza Unida party succeeded beyond most expectations. It brought inspiration to a generation of political activists who went on to organize within the Democratic and Republican parties.
It introduced to the American public a brand new generation of leadership. I think it destroyed forever the stereotype of an apathetic, passive people that were afraid to speak out.
Among those influenced by Raza Unida was Willie Velasquez. In 1974, he created the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, which encouraged many Mexican Americans to register to vote. In the years that followed, Velasquez worked with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund to challenge voting laws and policies that kept Mexican Americans from political power.
It is an interesting period because it is a time when people of Hispanic descent are beginning to mobilize their strength and are beginning to have impact in the American political process.
During the next 2 decades, more than 2 million new Latino voters were registered. In 20 years, there would be almost 5,000 Latino elected officials in the United States. Half would come from Texas. The victories of the Chicano movement became the lasting legacy of decades of Mexican-American activism. The United Farm Workers made Americans aware of the plight of workers who brought food to their table and inspired labor activists in the cities.
I think that the farm workers movement was one of those life-changing instruments that helped teach so many of us the power that lies within each one of ourselves.
The walkouts challenged educators to respond to community needs and served as a catalyst for bilingual instruction in grade schools and the creation of Chicano studies programs at colleges and universities.
Students said, ya basta. We can think, we can learn, we can speak more than one language. We can read, we can write, we can go on to college, we can be professionals. We can contribute not only to this society but to our communities in ways that teachers have told us we can't do in the past.
A generation of Mexican-American artists, writers, poets, and musicians reclaimed their heritage and gave new definition to American culture.
I think that Chicano art had a very, very important role within the Chicano movement because it not only said what was going on, but it also questioned things. And that's what made it as rich as it is now.
We were young, demanding civil rights, demanding our place in society, demanding access to education, demanding all of the things that we were entitled to as citizens of the United States, as human beings.
Chicanos, with a passion for social justice, helped bring about changes that expanded and inspired the meaning of civil rights in America.
To learn more about the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, visit us on the PBS homepage at the address on your screen.